Hi, and welcome to the edition of Ruins of Empire with your host, Rafael Pinheiro. Last time we were talking about moral choice systems in video games, but I thought, wait a minute, there's more to video games and morality than just moral choice systems, or the alignment, if you will, of the player character and the player behind it. In fact, I found that there were three major areas that I think I should discuss when it comes to morality. First and foremost, the nature of the enemies that you fight in a video game. There's certain moral choices made by the designers when it comes to those enemies and why they're there and why certain classes are chosen over others. Second is the moral atmosphere, if you will, of the virtual space in a video game. It tends to lend credence and justification for why the decisions are made and the player can or should do what they do in game, because most of the time the decisions and the actions made in video games are stuff that you wouldn't do in real life because, laws, regulations, traditions, and morality. And finally, and this is where it gets a bit tricky and a bit controversial, when we talk about the moral choices made by designer vis-a-vis, I know that sounds like a bit stupid Latinized term where basically another one should be better fitting or better. But there you go. Vis-a-vis player agency. What the designers in the game allow the players to do and what they don't allow you to do. So let's kick it off with enemies. Now, in the beginning, video games were thought to be, and many I still think, thought of as things for children. And because of that and a combination of, limitations of hardware, most of the enemies, when you had combat situations, were things like, asteroids, or dodging cars in a highway, or a ghost in a maze, right? Very colorful, non-human things, right? It's very difficult to animate humans or animate anything really with any sense of realism, right? And so that combination of factors led to a lot of the early games in arcades and in consoles and computer games, etc., PC gaming, to have the kind of enemies that were robots and stuff like that, right? But very quickly stuff evolved, and so by the mid-1980s and late 1980s, you could show some graphics like blood and bones and stuff like that showed a passing relationship with humans or things that are humanoid, right? And but yeah, for the most part, not for the most part, increasingly, many games and even today choose to have very specific type of enemies that are easily to justify when it comes to, say, shooting them down or blowing them up. Not all of them, right? But many of them, such as zombies, all kinds of inhuman monsters, robots, etc. And sort of the first type of, I would say, acceptable targets. We go by the TV tropes page. That is, because these things are not alive or they're not really human, they're okay, to blow them up, because clearly they have no connection whatsoever to reality. Very easy to suspend disbelief, and killing a gigantic mutated monster. Well, that doesn't exist. It's not real. You're not really harming anyone. You're not simulating the death or the dismemberment of actual human beings. And I know the giant caveat in the room is there's absolutely no proof that playing a video game or being exposed to any one piece of media will lead to someone to go screaming into the night to murder the first person or kitten they come across, right? That's not true. I mean, that doesn't happen that way. All the arguments made about in normalization and stuff like that, but we're not going to make those arguments tonight. Tonight we're talking about the decision of game designers to choose inhuman, monstrous targets to be destroyed by the player. It makes it much easier for you to pull the trigger, right? If you're convinced that you're shooting a zombie, stuff like that, and that is sort of a moral choice, right? You could, especially today, you could easily say, no, we're not going to make a monster. We're not going to go for a zombie. We're going to make as realistic a human being as possible, and we're going to go out of our way to animate them in such a way that people can see how in depth, the death and destruction that the players bringing upon them by using explosives or guns or whatever. And some games, in fact, relish that. But even games that relish that have a situation where the type of enemies are still sort of socially acceptable enemies, such as Nazis, right? Let me give a comparison. The earliest first-person shooters. Wolfenstein 3D, your enemies were Nazis. Technically human, but because they're evil bastard Nazis, well, they were Nazis, and everybody knows that Nazis are evil, and so shooting a Nazi in the head is not that bad, right? And then, of course, they introduce things like, Hitler in a giant suit of power armor with Gatling guns. Are like, well, whatever. It's Hitler, right? 55 million souls screaming for revenge cannot be wrong. But when you talk about Doom, its successor by id Software, and not only that, it's far bigger successor in terms of sales and impact. Again, the enemy, the blood and gore was there, but aside from the zombie-like or zombie-fied former Marines in the Mars base, everything is, again, it's demons, it's monsters. Most of them are so grotesque, both because of the quality of the graphics of the time, as well as just their general appearance, that blasting a Cacodemon to bits, even if you see kind of bones sticking out of this sort of 2.5D representation sprite on the floor. It's like, well, whatever, it's a demon, it was out to hurt me, it was out to kill me, so who cares? Again, a decision was, and then, for example, when Quake, the first Quake came along, and even Quake 2, you were fighting, cyborg enemies, cyborg aliens in Quake 2, and in Quake 1, it was basically a remake of Doom, and you were fighting demons again. You're trapped in hell, that kind of thing. So I was just playing again Painkiller Black and Black Edition, and you're in hell fighting skeletons and stuff like that. In games like, many fantasy games, you have the situation where you're fighting, again, inhuman monsters, lizard men, dragons, orcs, that sort of thing. And yeah, you could get pretty graphic in the dismemberment and what have you, and setting them on fire, but, the bulk of the enemies are there, and that makes it acceptable, right? You're not breaking the taboo of thou shalt not kill, or representations of death, because the things that you're supposedly killing, virtually of course, are not human, or barely human. To add to that is the moral environment. Many games that have combat, of course, put you in a war zone. Could it be, the old World War II type FPSs or common, situation, or many zombie games put you in a zombie apocalypse where basically the veneer of civilization has been stripped and you are out for survival, right? And you have to do whatever it takes to survive. So when you combine the fact that you're fighting zombies, even if they're people that are humans that are infected, but they're beyond saving, right? And if you don't kill them, they will in fact tear you to shreds and turn you into one of them, or just kill you outright. There's a certain glee to be had of winning the game or escaping the situation by, hitting them over with an electrified wrench right over the head until they just collapse into a heap. In other games, such as crime sandbox games, the situation is, or in a case like, say, Fallout 3, which is you're in the wasteland, you are in a situation where, again, morality and society, as we know, it is fundamentally broken or non-existent, right? And your moral choices are your own, and nobody would really blame you if you did things that would be morally questionable or even acceptable, that would get you arrested in a normal situation. For example, although the police will come to arrest you in a GTA type game, the fact of the matter is that the games in the Grand Theft Auto series, in Saints Row, are presented as being inherently corrupt at all levels, where the best people are just incredibly naive or willfully ignorant, almost to a criminal point. Everybody else is corrupt at different points. And everybody, police will arrive, they won't try to arrest you, they will try to shoot you in the head. Governments and politicians and church leaders, all of them are just insane, crazy, exploitative. And the vision of the world is extremely cynical, and that means that the player character is not someone who stands out because of the violence and murder they commit within the virtual space, but in fact they're just better at it than other people in the virtual space. If you're driving over a little old lady on the sidewalk, makes you feel guilty, then the only thing you have to do is stand on that sidewalk for a little while until wait somebody else drives over you. It's like, well, the way this game world works is that people are just crazy, stupid, or both, with a touch of being nasty and evil and selfish to boot, right? So your actions are justified by the situation you find yourself in. The game designer crafts a universe that allows you and gives you permission to do this. The extreme format of this is what I call fighting the Horde, right? Games like Shadow of Mordor and BioWare games like the original Dragon Age Origins, and Mass Effect present the player not simply with a conflict, right? A war. But they present you with a conflict with basically a force that, if it's not stopped by any means necessary, it will destroy everyone and everything. Not only the player character will lose, right, will die, but it will basically, if their failure means everybody dies, right? Everybody will be horribly mutated, corrupted, enslaved, and massacred in the thousands, 100,000, millions, billions, and even trillions. Take the Reapers. The Reapers are just machines that are out every 50,000 years, come on and just blow up everything. You have, the unstoppable horde of the Blight, right? The Darkspawn. They're just corrupted and evil, and they don't speak, and they come out and set out to destroy you, right? Now, some designers are aware of this and try to, like BioWare, at times subvert this thing, right? Like, not every Darkspawn is spawn of evil. Some of them can talk if you play certain DLC. There might be other reasons for what's going on, and they might not be the only force of evil out there, of course. But again, when presented with that situation, it is very easy to justify just about anything you do, right? You can do this because this is the kind of atmosphere, this is the kind of world that invites that kind of action. And that serves as sort of greasing the moral wheel, if you will, right? You create, the designers create a world where the actions the players will take can always be justified within the concept of the world. Which brings me to the last aspect of this, and that is the idea of the moral choices that the designers make when they decide to give, empower, or de-empower, or take away player agency in the game. In some games, in many games, for example, there's a rule, an unwritten rule, that you can either have children, or if you have children, they cannot be harmed. That's not a universal rule, but it is a common rule, right? And that's a moral decision. The designers decided that they're not going to create a game wherein children will be harmed in any way, shape, or form. They decided to do that. They could do it, and I've seen games where that can be done, but they decided not to do that. And they apply that rule. And they decide to do that, and they prevent you from, basically even pointing a gun at a child, if the child are present at all. You cannot kick a dog, you cannot, grab a cat by its tail. You cannot do things that many people would consider to be cruel, insensitive, or just plain evil, right? Even in worlds where, again, going back to GTA or the DC Wasteland, stuff like that, or Steelport or Stillwater in Saints Row, where you can do almost anything you want to anyone there, you cannot do these things to children or pets or animals and stuff like that. They're mentioned to be existing. They exist in the world. You don't even see schools. You don't see universities. Harming children is something that's not allowed. And this is a decision made by designers, right? Decided that they were not going to give the player the opportunity to do that. In other cases, they do give the player opportunities to do things that are morally questionable, right? Such as being able to kill just about anything in the world, or engage in certain behaviors that are questionable. And that is also a moral choice, because they are empowering the player to do so. The players might decide not to have that choice, not to follow through and say, you know what, I am going to do that. And that's a decision from the player's point of view. from the audience is saying, you know what, I don't want to harm this person. For whatever reason, I don't like this person or this situation. I want to walk away, etc. I'm not going to do it. But that doesn't detract from the fact that the designers created a game that allowed you to do that. And I'm not talking about exploits. I'm not talking about mods, which I've seen a lot of mods out there which are pretty questionable, right? I'm talking about stuff that is in game. Let me give you an example. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas had in the disc the so-called hot coffee mod. However, that was just, according to every story that I read about it, that was one designer who said, you know what, I'm just going to play around and have CJ, the main character, play puppet sex in the game. But it was there, it was in the disc, but it was buried, right? There was really no way to activate it unless you modded the game. And when modders discovered that and restored that functionality, specifically on PC, Rockstar, who had received for a very long time criticism of creating games that are very particularly violent and even heinous in the name of some people, right, and encouraging violence and all that, recalled as many games as they could, and then re-released the game both for consoles, which was harder to mod, although possible, and PC without any trace of the coffee mod, if you will, hot coffee mod. In other words, you could not get into the position where you literally were going to practice puppet sex with, characters in game. That was seen by Rockstar and Take-Two Interactive as being too far. Something they did not want to have in the game. You could have simulated sex, Later on, they added stuff like first-person sexual encounters and stuff like that. But for that time, they decided that was too much. Now, there's also, like anything moral, there's also the possibility of outside pressure, right? The politicians and concerned parents and even some players would just, say, oh, this is too far, and put pressure on the designers and distributors to say, you know what, this is too much. And that's also part of the moral matrix. Morality is not simply individual. We don't exist in a vacuum. And that's, I think, ultimately the lesson that you have to extract from this. Some people would say, well, again, it doesn't matter. This is completely virtual. The decisions of the players don't matter, etc. But again, if you consider art as something that's important, right, and you consider that video games are art, and I do consider that video games are art, then video games do not exist in a vacuum, like I said when I was talking about politics in video games. And so the moral decisions, whatever they may be, from the designers do have an impact in how the games are made and how they are received by the public and players, right? What they allow you to do or don't do, the enemies decide to fight or not, etc., all have an impact. All the moral choices that are being made often is being more diverse, right? Include representation of LGBT characters, right? That's a moral decision. That is saying, in real life, there seems to be a disparity between the presence of LGBT folk and their representation in media. We are creating a form of media and we decided that we're going to represent them. That's a moral choice. Now, you may agree with that choice, you might disagree with that choice, but that is a moral choice. And it does have an impact, and it has in some members of the audience. Some people say, oh, I don't want to see that, I'm not going to play it. Other people say, hey, great. They welcome the representation. So it's not just simply about violence, it's not simply about combat. Morality in games shapes game design trends, as we've seen, for example, the trend of putting a lot of zombies in games, because zombies are things that are much easier to justify, taking down than real human beings. Switching, for example, from fighting terrorists, usually of Russian and or Muslim background, to, say, private PMCs, private military contractors, i.e. mercenaries, people who work for money and therefore, are questionable in their allegiance to begin with. Revival of fighting Nazis in games like the latest Wolfenstein. Well, not always, it was about fighting Nazis, so, again, it's come back into the fold. And even games like Saints Row went from your typical crime sandbox where you could just mow down everything to putting the player in a virtual space, right? And within a simulation where you could easily justify killing people who were just, they're represented as being fake, if not being really alive. And the latest version of the game literally puts you in hell. So all the people, all the things you're fighting are either demons or condemn souls. And in fact, even has game modes where you can be cruel to be kind, that the pain that you inflict on these souls can actually help them in the long run escape hell and go back through purgatory, perhaps go back to the land of the living or something, or even earn their way back to heaven or whatever, right? Whatever the theology that the game allows. And in fact, the game even allows you a couple of things that seem to be almost a complete reverse to what, from whence Saints Row came from. Not only as a member of the genre of crime box, I guess crime box is a way of saying it, crime sandbox games, as well as its own series as well. And some people may like it, some people may hate it, but those again are decisions that are made by the designers. And so again, the final lesson is that video games do have a moral element. They have a social element, they have a political element, and certainly have a social element. And the moral element is not just about the player's choices, right? This is right, this is wrong. It is far more complex than that. So that's all I have to say about this subject for now. As always, I welcome your comments and hope you subscribe, and I'll see you when I see you. Good night.